best friend's birthday. We watched a scary movie in the dark. After we shut off all the lights, TV, everything, and my ex started talking about how I thought the place was haunted and how she believed it to be BS. Just at that moment, directly behind her friend, a framed propped up picture of us fell forward onto the table. Not fell, but more like angrily slapped. Everyone shrieked, and then we all laughed. I laughed too, but more so to give off the impression that I wasn't scared. We got married and moved into our house in September 2012. In October, I started having what I thought were strokes. At the time, I was using a supplement which contained something called 1,3-dimethylene hydrochloride, basically a fancy way to say meth. Without the FDA breathing down their necks, it was called Jack 3D. I'm sure many of you exercise freaks remember it. The doctors figured that was my problem and told me to stop, so I did. The panic attacks persisted. I went to the ER 11 times and saw 7 cardiologists. Funny thing is, these attacks only occurred in that house. It got to a point where even my ex would say, you know, I be having a great day, but as soon as I walk in this house, I feel horrible. I took that as maybe she was just feeding off my negativity, but I agreed. Something in there wasn't happy with us. We shouldn't have been there. The rest is short and concise. It had been months, maybe 4. Things would fall off the wall. We had a plate attached to some hooks in the wall, which said something about how a home is only a home with love, or some Hallmark BS. It was thrown halfway across the room. It shattered. We'd come home to find pictures all over the floors. Toilet paper unraveled. Her explanation of this was that our 4-pound teacup Pomeranian did it. No way. He stood on his effing hind legs for a minute straight and unraveled a roll of toilet paper that was way too high up for him anyway. And those footsteps, those inconsistent footsteps, never ending. The most horrifying moment was in late winter. My puppy was in my lap and something caused him to stand at attention. His muscles was tense and solid as concrete. Unmoving tail pointed to the ceiling. I heard the footsteps again, only this night they were especially active. I felt that the sanctity of our house was truly threatened. Henry growled just as the steps moved from the roof to the hallway, then down to the stairs in the living room. I didn't even try to look. I grabbed Henry and we ran out the front door and just watched the monolithic brick entity leer down at me with those 4-body second-story windows as eyes and yawning, aghast mouth from the door. Desperation. The basement was the worst part of the house. We both were terrified of it and she would never go down there without me. Finally, we got what we were waiting for. Infutable proof before both of our eyes that something not of this earth was with us and that we needed to leave. Her stepdad and mom came over. My stepdad-in-law sat on the couch watching football. They were in the kitchen. We had a hanging plant in the dining room. Mind you, as this was all occurring, we had the front door opened. Some air could get in through the glass screen door. So she's chatting with her mom about whatever. Suddenly, the flower pot began swinging. I mean, swinging. Very forceful. I swear even the wind from a horrible thunderstorm couldn't have gotten it to do this. My ex yelled out my name. I walked in and watched back and forth. Back and forth. Something was pushing it. Finally, her mother had enough, and being the tough woman she was a captain at a jail after all. She screamed, "Whoever you are, you need to leave this house. It no longer belongs to you." The swinging suddenly halted to a stop. When I turned around, the front door was slowly shutting on its own. No breeze, no wind. It didn't shut all the way, but just that creaky sound is enough to give someone the heebie-jeebies. Within a few weeks, things started to get better, happier, but it didn't stay that way. It started all over again, only much fiercer and uglier. The moment that made us consider really moving again was one night in the It scared us so much I almost spilled a pan full of burning grease all over me. The negativity came back, the footsteps came back, and that basement was akin to walking into a rung of hell. We moved out after a year. I drove past that house a few times later on after we'd been gone, didn't notice anything except once. I slowly crept by and pulled over in front one evening. It wasn't light or dark, almost dusk. I was staring at something in the living room window, curtains perhaps. Something caught my eye. Then one of the curtains brushed to the side, and I saw a face. My heart skipped and I was frozen. I actually jumped in my seat, no lights on inside. This is no BS. I looked closely. It may sound funny now, but it wasn't then. It looked like someone who was in the Revolutionary War. The entity had white hair like an old powder wig, a painting from the 18th century, just like the wig that Washington has on in all his portraits. It looked at me very still and rigid. I couldn't make out much of his face nor the eyes, which looked like little black buttons. Its expression was very droll, like the way your white-haired grandmother will give a child the death stare for stealing out the cookie jar. Kind of like, you do that again, you're in for it. Eerily, it gave me a look like it recognized me and was telling me, don't come near this house. I put the car in drive and we watched each other as I drove away from a house with no cars in the driveway and a for sale sign on the lawn. I went home and told her. She said I was lying. That was until 3 years later, her cousin's friend who lived on that very street, aptly named Washington Avenue, told her that people would frequent that home and move out quickly. She never connected the dots. She said it was because there were projects not far down that road. I knew otherwise. All these years later, it spooks the hell out of me that we were in there with that thing I saw the entire time. Why didn't it show itself to me before? Had I seen it, or had either of us seen it prior to moving in? We wouldn't have. To this day, that year was one of the most powerful, disturbing points of my life. I also like to note that in the house I grew up in, which is the place my dad died in, I literally saw his ghost sitting in his favorite living room chair in the middle of the night. I've never been so scared. This experience dwarfed that beyond all recognition. Okay, that was very intense. Honestly, like, I don't know what I would have done. Actually, you know what, I'm lying. I do know what I would have done. The first sign of anything abnormal She tried to make heads or tails of what it was she was staring at. She tried to call out to the strange creature as if it needed help. It was the Christian thing to do after all, but she found her voice strained as only a small squeak came out as the skin of the creature began to shift. Sister Selma's eyes became as round as dinner plates as she ducked her head and began to pray to the good Lord. She didn't get far in her prayer though, as a loud yelp could be heard from outside the vehicle, accompanied by the sounds of yelling. When Sister Selma looked out her windshield, she could see the young Milton boy running down the road, but no sign of the creature. Sister Selma began to relax, taking in a deep breath that caught in her throat as she looked carefully at the young man that approached her. He waved at her with his left arm, his palm stained dark red with what Sister Selma could only think was blood. The boy's right arm laid at his side, stiff and unmoving as the blood slowly dripped from his fingertips. The boy's face was the last thing Sister Selma noticed as they let me tell you. The fear in that boy's eyes nearly sent the dear sister running. Now Sister Selma was the most devoted servant of God you would ever see. Some even say she was more devoted than the people himself, than the Pope himself, and would gladly argue the point with anyone who said otherwise. But let me tell you, in this moment, she would have thrown her faith out the window in a heartbeat and left this town and her life behind if she thought it would save her from the fear she felt. Sister Selma outbeat stupidly, clung to her faith instead, and even hopped out of her vehicle heading towards the young man to help him. As she loaded the young man into her vehicle, she took in her surroundings for the first time since seeing that horrible creature, and what she saw makes her weak to this day. The last anyone in this small town saw of her dropping the young Milton boy off at the local hospital, she had obviously been drinking, which was uncommon for her, and ranting about how there is no God, and later, as the death count started to climb, she left, leaving all to wonder what she saw. The Milton boy, Carl, was more inclined to speak of the events he saw play out. This, dear reader, was the point where the danger no longer followed the Miltons, but the entire town. A few hours prior to Sister Selma's encounter with the strange hairy creature, the Miltons had just settled down to eat their dinner. It was 5 in the evening, the same time they always ate dinner, and Carl's pal had just returned from Mr. Douglas' farm, where he worked as a farmhand and attended to the cattle. Carl couldn't remember what they spoke of, but what he did remember Sister Selma being brought up a few times, how the family was tired of her trying to convert them to a religion that had no grounds to stand on. That was when they heard it. It all started. It started out small, almost inaudible, but the moment they heard it, they all froze. Carl, being the youngest of the children, hadn't realized what was happening as his mom hurried him down a flight of stairs and into the basement. The noise came again, this time louder, sending his older siblings into a panic as they pushed Carl and rushed into the basement. However, this was a mistake. A hand shot out of the darkness and wrapped around Emily's, the Milton's oldest, throat and began to squeeze. She fought back desperately, trying to free herself of the hand, but couldn't muster up the strength she needed to pull away. In the end, the hand made a sharp twisting movement, and the sickening sounds of bones breaking could be heard as poor Emily stopped moving. Carl was so transfixed on Emily that he hadn't noticed his older brother Mark was laying on the ground a few feet away from his sister. Mark had been the lucky one. His death was instant, or so Carl had said. He couldn't clarify if it truly was or wasn't. He could only describe the scene he saw. Mark laid on the ground, his neck torn open, revealing bone and muscle. It looked as though the creature had stood over Mark, a creature Carl could only describe from movies and video games, as a werewolf had almost bit clean through his neck and only left enough for his head to stay attached. Carl turned to run, to rush into the safety of his maw and paw, only to hear the sounds of his paws. 45 firing off a shot as a large creature that could have been mistaken for human steadily approached him. Carl's eyes went from wide as he realized his maw was being dragged behind this giant creature. Blood smeared her face and matted her hair, her dress. The same dress she wore every Sunday was torn from neck to groin. Blood smeared onto the floor, the sickening sound of bones being dragged across the wood could be heard. Carl fell to his knees. He didn't dare make a sound or even move. He stayed where he was as he watched as the giant man lifted his hand and brought it down onto his paw's head, crushing him and turning him into a bloody pulp. Then came his turn. One of the creatures grabbed his arm, and he must have gotten an adrenaline boost or something because he fought back, pulling at his right arm and managed to free himself as he escaped into the front yard, where he saw Sister Selma, or at least that is what he said. Dear reader, I am going to tell you not to trust such things. If a monster, be it man or otherwise, has the strength to crush a full-grown man, then a boy is nothing. You see, when Sister Selma finally spoke up about what she saw to the survivors of this small town, she told him that she had seen the Milton family's bodies hanging in the trees. Pieces of their bodies were missing and even described what the young Milton boy had described. But what scared her the most was the last body that hung from the tree. It was the body of Carl, torn in half. Young Carl had not survived the encounter with the creature, and Sister Selma feared that if she let on, she knew she would be the next person to hang from those trees. This is just the beginning of the end for the small town in southern Colorado. Join me next time as we explore what happens to young Carl and learn about these creatures called Skinwalkers. Okay, that was spooky.